Once upon a time, long before our modern world of smartphones and fast cars, a little princess was born who would one day rule over a vast empire. This princess was named Alexandrina Victoria, and she arrived on a spring morning, the 24th of May, 1819. She was born in a grand palace in London called Kensington Palace. At the time, no one could have guessed just how important this tiny baby would become. Her father was Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, and he was the fourth son of the reigning king, George III. Her mother was a German princess named Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a kind and determined woman who had left her home to marry into the British royal family. Victoria's birth was not just a happy family event. It was a moment of great significance for the entire kingdom. The royal family, known as the House of Hanover, was in a bit of a crisis. King George III was old and unwell, and his sons had failed to produce a legitimate heir to continue the royal line. This meant that the future of the monarchy was uncertain, and people were worried about who would rule after the current generation of princes passed away. The arrival of a healthy baby girl, even if she was only fifth in line to the throne, brought a glimmer of hope. She represented a new beginning for a royal family that desperately needed one. Her parents' story was itself a whirlwind romance born out of royal duty. Prince Edward, a stern military man, had lived much of his life abroad and had never married. But with the succession in jeopardy, he knew he had to find a wife and produce an heir. He chose Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a widow with 2 children from her first marriage. They met, married, and soon the Duchess was expecting a child. They were living in Germany when she became pregnant, but they were determined that their baby should be born on British soil. So they undertook a long and difficult journey back to London, arriving just in time for the birth. This journey highlights how much her parents wanted their child to be seen as truly British. They travelled in a heavy, horse-drawn carriage across Europe, a journey that took weeks and was quite uncomfortable for the heavily pregnant Duchess. Their arrival at Kensington Palace was a relief, and the birth of a healthy daughter was a triumph. The little princess was christened Alexandrina Victoria, with one name honouring her godfather, the Tsar of Russia, and the other, her mother. From her very first moments, Victoria was at the centre of a story of royal duty, hope, and the future of a nation. Her life had begun, and with it, a new chapter for Britain was about to unfold. Victoria's birth was part of what some people called the royal race. This was a frantic competition among the sons of King George III to marry and have a legitimate child who could inherit the throne. For many years, the king's sons had lived scandalous lives without producing any heirs within marriage. The king's eldest son, the Prince Regent, who would become King George IV, had only one daughter, Princess Charlotte. She was very popular, and everyone expected her to become queen one day. Tragically, she died in childbirth in 1817, and her baby died too. This terrible event threw the royal succession into chaos and sparked the race to find a new heir. Suddenly, the unmarried royal dukes, including Victoria's father, Prince Edward, knew they had a duty to perform. They had to find suitable royal brides and start families as quickly as possible. Prince Edward, who was already in his 50s, set aside his long-term mistress and began his search. He wasn't the only one. His brothers, the Duke of Clarence, who would become King William IV, and the Duke of Cambridge, also got married in 1818. It was a strange and urgent time, with the future of the British monarchy hanging in the balance. The nation watched and waited to see which of these new royal marriages would produce the next person in line for the crown. Victoria's mother, Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, was a clever and strategic choice for Prince Edward. She was a German princess from a respected, though not particularly wealthy, royal house. Importantly, she had already proven she could have children, as she had a son and daughter from her first marriage. She was also the sister of Leopold, the widower of the beloved Princess Charlotte. This connection made her a sympathetic figure to the British public and linked her directly to the tragic loss that had created the succession crisis in the first place. Her marriage to Edward was arranged quickly, and they were wed in 1818, joining the other royal couples in the race. When little Victoria was born in May 1819, she was a winner in this royal race. Although she wasn't the very first child born to the dukes, her cousins born just before her were either girls who were further down the line of succession or had sadly died in infancy. Her birth secured her father's place in the story of the monarchy. Even though she was only a girl, and fifth in line, her existence provided a crucial new link in the chain of succession. The frantic race had produced a potential future queen, and from that day forward, the little princess in Kensington Palace was a figure of national importance. When Princess Victoria was born, she was fifth in line to the British throne. This might sound quite far away from becoming queen, but in the world of royal families, things can change very quickly. At the top was her grandfather, the old and ailing King George III. After him came his sons. First was the Prince Regent George, who had no living children. Second was the Duke of York, who was married but also had no children. Third was the Duke of Clarence, who had 2 daughters, but they both died as babies. And fourth was Victoria's own father, the Duke of Kent. So, the path to the throne for Victoria depended on a lot of ifs and maybes. Victoria's family background was a mix of British and German heritage. Her royal house was the House of Hanover, a German dynasty that had come to rule Britain in 1714. This happened because the previous monarch, Queen Anne, died without any children. The crown had to pass to her nearest Protestant relative, who was George, the Elector of Hanover in Germany. He arrived in Britain as King George I without speaking a word of English. For over 100 years, the Hanoverian kings had ruled Britain, but they always maintained strong ties to their German roots, often marrying German princes and princesses. Victoria's own mother was German, and German was the first language Victoria learned to speak. This German connection was a bit of a sensitive subject. While the royal family was respected, some British people felt that the Hanoverians were too foreign. They had German accents, German relatives, and sometimes seemed more interested in their lands in Hanover than in the affairs of Britain. Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, was very aware of this. After Victoria's father died when she was just a baby, the Duchess made sure that her daughter was raised to be thoroughly British. She wanted to ensure that when Victoria eventually took the throne, no one could accuse her of being a foreigner. This meant a strict English education and a life lived entirely in England. So while Victoria was growing up in Kensington Palace, she was living a life caught between 2 cultures. She spoke German with her mother and her governess, but she studied English history and learned about the British Constitution. She was part of a long line of German royals who had to prove their loyalty and dedication to their British subjects. Her childhood was carefully managed to shape her into the perfect future monarch for Britain. One who understood her German ancestry, but was, heart and soul, dedicated to the country she was destined to rule. This unique upbringing would be incredibly important in preparing her for the challenges ahead. Section 4. A glimpse of Georgian Britain. The Britain that Princess Victoria was born into was a country of enormous and rapid change. It was a world without electricity, where homes were lit by candles and oil lamps, and the fastest way to travel was by horse-drawn carriage. A journey from London to Manchester, which takes a couple of hours by train today, would have taken several days of bumping along muddy, uneven roads. People communicated by sending letters, which were carried across the country by mail coaches. These coaches were often targeted by highwaymen, masked robbers who would stop them at gunpoint. It was an exciting but also a dangerous time to be alive. For most people, life was tied to the land and the seasons. Many families lived in small villages and worked in agriculture, farming the fields just as their ancestors had for centuries. Their lives were hard, and they depended on good harvests to survive. However, this traditional way of life was beginning to disappear. A great change known as the Industrial Revolution was sweeping across the country. New factories were being built in towns and cities, powered by incredible new machines. These factories produced goods like textiles and iron far more quickly and cheaply than ever before, changing the way people worked and lived forever. Cities like London, Manchester, and Birmingham were growing at a tremendous speed. People left their farms and villages in search of work in the new factories, and the cities became crowded, noisy, and often very dirty. There were no proper sewage systems, and smoke from the factory chimneys filled the air, creating a thick fog, or smog, that hung over the streets. While some people became very rich from this new industry, most factory workers lived in poor conditions, working long hours for very low pay. It was a time of great invention and progress, but also a time of great hardship and inequality for many ordinary people. This was the world outside the walls of Kensington Palace, where the young Victoria was growing up. While she lived a sheltered and privileged life, the great changes happening across Britain would shape the country she would one day rule. The rise of the factories, the growth of cities, and the new ways of travel were all part of a powerful transformation. The quiet, rural Britain of the past was giving way to a modern industrial nation. Victoria's reign would oversee the peak of this incredible era, a time when Britain would become the most powerful and technologically advanced country in the world. Section 5. A kingdom of smoke and steam. During Victoria's childhood, Britain was not just changing physically, it was also changing politically and socially. The power of the monarch was not what it used to be. For centuries, kings and queens had held absolute power. But now, Parliament was the true centre of government. The king or queen was the head of state, a powerful symbol for the nation, but they could not make laws or raise taxes on their own. Instead, they had to work with the politicians in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. This system, known as a constitutional monarchy, meant that the ruler had to be politically neutral and act on the advice of their government. This period was also a time of great social unrest and calls for reform. Many people felt that the political system was unfair. Only wealthy men who owned property were allowed to vote, which meant that the vast majority of ordinary working people had no say in how the country was run. Cities that had grown massive during the Industrial Revolution had no representatives in Parliament, while some tiny, deserted villages still sent politicians to London. People protested and campaigned for change, leading to major reforms like the Great Reform Act of 1832, which gave the vote to more men in the middle classes and made the system fairer. Education and religion were also undergoing significant shifts. For most of history, education was only for the rich. Ordinary children were expected to work as soon as they were old enough. But during this time, there was a growing belief that everyone deserved a basic education. Churches and charities began to set up schools for poor children, teaching them how to read, write, and do simple arithmetic. Religion was still very important in people's lives, with the Church of England being the official state church. However, other Protestant groups, like the Methodists, were growing in popularity, especially among the new industrial working classes. All these changes created a society that was dynamic and full of tension. The Industrial Revolution had created immense wealth, but it had also created terrible poverty and crowded, unhealthy cities. There was a growing gap between the rich and the poor. At the same time, new ideas about democracy, education, and social justice were spreading. People were beginning to demand better living conditions and more rights. This was the complex and challenging Britain that was waiting for its future queen. She would need to be a ruler who could provide stability in a time of incredible change and inspire a nation that was redefining itself. Section 6. The Unlikely Heir. When Victoria was a little girl, playing with her dolls in Kensington Palace, the idea that she would one day be queen must have seemed like a distant fairy tale. She was, after all, only fifth in the line of succession. A whole row of older male relatives stood between her and the throne. But one by one, fate intervened, and the obstacles on her path began to disappear. The first major event had happened before she was even a year old. Her father, the Duke of Kent, caught a cold that developed into pneumonia, and he died in January 1820. This was a devastating loss for Victoria and her mother, but it also moved the tiny princess one step closer to the throne, up to fourth in line. Just a week after her father's death, the old king, George III, also passed away. His son, the Prince Regent, became King George IV. This moved Victoria up another place, to third in line. The new King George IV was not fond of Victoria or her ambitious mother. He was a selfish man who disliked children and tried to make their lives difficult. After him in the line of succession was his brother, the Duke of York. For years, the Duke of York stood as the heir apparent. However, he also died without any children in 1827. Suddenly, the young Princess Victoria, now just 8 years old, was second in line to the throne. The only person who now stood between Victoria and the crown was her uncle, the Duke of Clarence. When King George IV died in 1830, the Duke of Clarence became King William IV. He was an elderly man and, like his brothers, had no surviving legitimate children. His wife, Queen Adelaide, was devoted to him, but they were unable to produce an heir who lived past infancy. King William IV was a kind and friendly man who was very fond of his young niece, Victoria. He often called her the heiress presumptive, meaning she was the heir as long as he didn't have a child of his own. He famously declared that he hoped to live long enough to see her turn 18, so she could rule in her own right, without a regent. And so, through a series of deaths and childless marriages, the little girl who started as fifth in line found herself as the direct heir to the most powerful throne in the world. It was a remarkable turn of events that no one could have predicted at her birth. The royal race that her father had entered had paid off in the most spectacular way. As she entered her teenage years, the reality of her destiny began to sink in. The nation's eyes were upon her, watching and waiting for the day that she would become their queen. Her unlikely journey to the top of the line of succession was almost complete. Section 7. A Queen in the Making. Victoria's childhood was anything but ordinary. After her father's death, she was raised by her mother, the Duchess of Kent, under a strict set of rules known as the Kensington system. This system was designed by her mother and her ambitious advisor, Sir John Conroy. They wanted to keep Victoria isolated from the corrupt royal court and mould her into a queen who would be completely dependent on them. She was not allowed to be alone, ever. She had to hold someone's hand when she walked down the stairs. She shared a bedroom with her mother every night, and she rarely met children her own age. It was a lonely and controlled upbringing. Despite the loneliness, her education was thorough and designed to prepare her for her future role. She was taught languages, history, geography, and music by her governess, Baroness Leitzen. She learned to speak fluent German and French, as well as some Italian and Latin. She kept a detailed journal every day, a habit she would continue for the rest of her life. These journals show us a girl who was intelligent, observant, and sometimes stubborn. She had a strong sense of duty and a deep Christian faith, which gave her strength during her often difficult childhood. She loved drawing, singing, and her little dog, Dash, who was her constant companion. Her personality was perfectly suited for the challenges that lay ahead. She could be strong-willed and even bossy, which frustrated her mother and Sir John Conroy, but it was a sign of the determination she would need as a ruler. She had a passionate nature, capable of great affection, but also of strong dislikes. She hated the Kensington system and resented the control that Conroy tried to exert over her. This experience taught her to be independent and to trust her own judgment. When she finally turned 18, she was ready to break free from their influence and stand on her own 2 feet as a monarch. Victoria's upbringing, though restrictive, ultimately prepared her well for queenship. It gave her a strong moral compass, a powerful sense of duty, and the resilience to overcome control and manipulation. On the 20th of June, 1837, just a month after her 18th birthday, King William IV died. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain rushed to Kensington Palace in the early hours of the morning to wake the young princess and tell her that she was now Queen of the United Kingdom. Her lonely childhood was over. A new era, the Victorian age, was about to begin, and the young woman at its head was ready for her destiny.